Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to our speaker series with Mr. Jim Briggs, one of our parishioners. Many of you know Jim Briggs. He's a retired executive director of the School of Applied Theology and former executive assistant to the president and vice president of student services at Santa Clara University. He has a background in higher education, theology, and career development. I am very grateful to Jim for taking on this pastoral but Herculean task of unpacking one of the most beautiful, relevant, thought-provoking, controversial encyclicals that Pope Francis has published, Fratelli Tutti. I invite Jim Briggs to our conversation. Jim, what do you want to say to our parishioners as you begin this conversation?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to Paulson. I appreciate this opportunity. We have lots to talk about tonight and again next week at the same time.
All right. I want to ask you the first question. How do you summarize the intent of the encyclical and the message Francis is trying to send in Fratelli Tutti?
You know, there were three words that came to mind as I thought about this encyclical. They are timely, critical, and inspirational. I think it's very timely. The Pope obviously put a lot of thought and discernment into the writing of this encyclical. I think he felt that this was an important moment in time, that there was a sense of urgency about what he had to say, given some of the challenges and trends that he talks about in the encyclical that are facing our world today. And he's critical of some of those trends, very concerned about some of them, and we'll talk more about those later. But in the end, it's a very aspirational and inspirational kind of document. He has some very clear recommendations for how we can go forward from here and what his vision is for reversing the negative trends and how we restore hope in our future. And it's his message, I think, is that we're one big human family. We're sharing the planet together, and as he says at one point, we're all in the same boat. So it's time to start viewing our relationship with one another, individually and globally, in a new way. How do I become a neighbor, a brother, a sister to everyone who needs us? I'm going to be sharing some slides of some of the text of the document with you as we go along this evening. I'll also be sticking pretty close to my notes because we have a lot to cover in a very limited amount of time. So we're going to look at this first slide, which is from the introduction of the encyclical. It is my desire that in this our time, by acknowledging the dignity of each human person, we can contribute to the rebirth of a universal aspiration to fraternity, fraternity between all men and women. Dreams are built together. Let us dream then as a single human family, a fellow traveler sharing the same flesh, as children of the same earth, which is our common home, each of us bringing the richness of his or her belief and convictions, each of us with his or her own voice, brothers and sisters all. And there's the connection to the title of the encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. There's been some criticism that this is exclusively masculine in its intent. The title of the encyclical comes directly from a quote from St. Francis. So that's the reason. But when you get into the substance of the encyclical, There's no question that Pope Francis is talking about all of us, men and women alike, brothers and sisters, all, as he says.
I just wanted to know, there are a couple of our parishioners wanted to thank you for the insights and helping our parish with this topic. Jim, tell me, to whom does Pope address this encyclical to?
Well, it's interesting because I think usually we think of encyclicals as directed to Catholics, that he's talking to the members of the Roman Catholic Church. My answer to that question is that this encyclical is really intended for everyone. Catholics and Christians, of course, but it's a universal message intended for all people, because I think it's going to take all people to realize the vision of universal aspiration for a social friendship that is what Francis is calling us to.
You know, I'll just add to that, saying, especially in the context of the pandemic, it's the response to our present-day attempts to eliminate or ignore others, and instead to promote a new vision of, as you said, fraternity and social friendship. To acknowledge, appreciate, love each person regardless of physical proximity, regardless of where he or she was born or lives. And I cannot agree with you, Jim, in the fact that Pope is addressing Catholics in particular, but the entire world. He's getting the attention of the whole world to the problems, challenges of today. How does the timing of Pope Francis's message relate to the United States, especially given the recent presidential elections? I guess elections are still not yet over, right?
Yeah, well, this encyclical came out on October 4th, so about a month before our election. We're talking about the encyclical after the election. And while I think there's certainly a resonance between what Francis talks about and what our current situation is in the United States, given all of our national crises, the COVID crises, the economic crisis coming out of the COVID crisis, the racial injustice questions that have been raised once again for us to pay attention to and try and resolve. All of these crises and divisions that we're experiencing certainly resonate with what we're sensing and feeling in our own country. But it was not taken as directed to the United States alone. That's not why it was written. It was written for everyone. And there are many nations, in addition to the United States, that are suffering from the same kinds of crises and divisions. That being said, I have to say that the words of President-elect Biden regarding the need for national unity, the importance of respectful dialogue, and the re-engagement with the global community are very consistent with what Francis is saying in Fratelli Tutti. And that gives me great hope.
Wonderful. And now we are going to jump into the encyclical itself. How is the encyclical laid out or developed in the introduction and the chapters of the encyclical?
Well, in the introduction, Francis talks about how he saw the need to write such a document, what his reasons were for doing so. And he connects his desire for this universal social friendship and fraternal love back to the saint after which he took his name, St. Francis. And in the very first paragraph of the encyclical, this is what he says. Of the counsels St. Francis offered, I would like to select the one in which he calls for a love that transcends the barriers of geography and distance, and declares blessed all those who love their brother as much as when he is far away from him as when he is with him. In this simple and direct way, St. Francis expressed the essence of a fraternal openness that allows us to acknowledge, appreciate, and love each person, regardless of physical proximity, regardless of where or he or she was born. In the introduction, he also references the document on human fraternity, which he authored with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar in February of 2019 as an inspirational influence, which he references actually multiple times in the course of the encyclical. Now, he follows the introduction with 8 chapters, which lay out the issues and challenges, mostly socioeconomic and political, that he sees in our contemporary world. And then also promises a path forward, as I said, a hope for how we address these issues and meet the challenges, including very clearly his vision for what I would call a more open, engaged, and inclusive world. More on this as we go chapter by chapter through the encyclical.
So tonight we will be focusing on the first 4 chapters of the encyclical, and next week we will talk about the last 4 chapters. Is this a reasonable way to divide up the discussion?
I think so. I think it is, especially given the length of the encyclical. As we've said, it includes 8 chapters, 45,000 words, and 122 citations and footnotes. So it's a very, very substantive document, and it covers a variety of topics, and it takes time and effort to get through the whole thing. So I think the fact that we're dividing this up into 2 sessions is actually a good thing.
Jim, and to all of you, there has been a criticism that Pope Francis is basically talking about his social teachings, social justice. Why doesn't he focus on the doctrines of the church? And one of the things that comes more and more prominently, very provocatively, is the Catholic doctrine, which is about human dignity and the common good in society. And so I think as you delve through chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, you will see Pope Francis dealing really with the Catholic doctrine about the dignity of the human person. The ideas talk about oppression, the role of state, subsidiarity, social organization, social concern, social justice, issues of wealth distribution, etc. The Pope is so much in touch with the challenges, the problems of the world, especially faced by the most vulnerable in our society. So let's start with chapter 1, entitled Dark Clouds Over a Cold World. This chapter lays out the context of the encyclical and points out some of the trends that are of concern to the Pope and which motivated him to write the encyclical. So Jim, what are some of these trends and concerns pointed out by Pope Francis?
Before I get into the trends, I just want to second what you say about Francis and doctrine, because I think he sees the world as the place in which we put our faith into practice. And as he's looking at the world and seeing its challenges, he's trying to offer a path forward that is actually very much based on, especially the Catholic social teaching of the Church, which is part of the dogma of the Church. So in terms of the issues and trends that he talks about, it's a list. There's quite a few things that he touches on in the course of the encyclical, but in this first chapter, he briefly outlines each one of the following: extreme nationalism, political polarization, human rights violations, including racism, slavery, and human trafficking. The societal emphasis on self-preservation and individualism. He even talks about social media and the pluses and minuses of that in our world today. And it's interesting that as he was writing this encyclical, the COVID crisis arose. So he actually also talks about COVID as an example of an opportunity for nations to come together and tackle a problem that affects all of us in a very comprehensive, collaborative kind of way. But in the end, he talks about the biggest concern, I think, of all of his, is the loss of a sense of belonging to a larger human family. Let me try and capture the essence of this in sharing some of his own words. Ancient conflicts, thought long buried, are breaking out anew, while instances of a myopic, extremist, resentful, and aggressive nationalism are on the rise. In some countries, a concept of popular and national unity influenced by various ideologies is creating new forms of selfishness and a loss of the social sense under the guise of defending national interests. This is one thing I love about Francis. He is a straight talker. He doesn't mince words or pull punches, and he tells it very much as he sees it. Now, these trends he talks about in some way can be summed up in this concern that we are losing this sense of belonging to a single human family. So here in the next slide is what he says about that. In today's world, the sense of belonging to a single human family is fading, and the dream of working together for justice and peace seems an outdated utopia. What reigns instead is a cool, comfortable, and globalized indifference born of deep disillusionment, concealed behind a deceptive illusion, thinking that we are all powerful while failing to realize that we are all in the same boat. So despite this dark and gloomy picture that he paints of our world in this first chapter, he actually ends on a very hopeful and inspirational note. He calls us to a renewed hope. So he says, I invite everyone to renewed hope, for hope speaks to us of something deeply rooted in every human heart, independently of our circumstances and historical conditioning. Hope speaks to us of a thirst, an aspiration, a longing for a life of fulfillment, a desire to achieve great things that fill our hearts and lift our spirits to lofty realities like lost my place here. Like truth and goodness and beauty and justice and love. Hope is bold. It can look beyond personal convenience, the petty securities and compensations which limit our horizon, and it can open us up to grand ideals that make life more beautiful and worthwhile. Let us to continue then to advance along this path of hope.
Thank you, Jim, for that. And one of the things that I looked at this first chapter, as you said, very pessimistic, razor-blade analysis of the contemporary world. The document reflects on the many distortions of contemporary era, the manipulation and deformation of concepts such as democracy, freedom, justice, the loss of the meaning of social community, and history, selfishness and indifference towards the common good, the prevalence of a market logic-based profit and the culture of waste, unemployment, racism, poverty. You mentioned many of those in your conversation, but it's really a gloomy, pessimistic view that is presented in the first chapter. You agree with that, right?
Yes, except for the way it ends, with this aspiration of hope, and renewed hope.
Yes. Thank you, Jim. So, chapter 1 provides us an overview of the world's challenges and ends with an invitation to renewed hope. Thank you for adding that dimension. Where does Pope Francis go from there in chapter 2, which is entitled Stranger on the Road? I love this chapter.
Yeah, so Stranger on the Road is a reference to the parable of the Good Samaritan. And this is a very clever transition from the litany of the ills of the world to the way that Francis proposes to address those ills through a renewed sense of all of our being part of the world community, and each one of us in that community, brothers and sisters all, as he says, living lives of loving kindness, compassion, and mercy. And to help us understand what is asked of us, he goes to the parable of the Good Samaritan. And how many times have we heard this parable? But just briefly, remember, the robbers come upon a man, they take his money, they beat him and leave him to suffer on the side of the road. Priests and religious types step to the other side of the road so they don't have to walk by him. Then comes the foreigner, the Samaritan, a total stranger who gives his tenderness, his time, his money to take care of the wounded person. We usually and correctly apply the message of this parable to an individual call to love and to feel compassion for our neighbor, even the stranger. But Francis takes it to a new level of a global call. So it's not just an individual call, but it's a call to the community, to the global community, in terms of how we interact with each other. And here's what Francis said about this parable. Jesus' parable summons us to rediscover our vocation as citizens of our respective nations and of the entire world, builders of a new social bond. This summons is ever new, yet it is grounded in a fundamental law of our being. We are called to direct society to the pursuit of the common good. And with this purpose in mind, to persevere in consolidating its political and social order, its fabric of relations, its human goals.
So Jim, how does Pope Francis relate the parable of the Good Samaritan to what he terms our call to fraternal love across boundaries?
Well, as I said, he takes it from sort of an individual example to the example of global and societal responsibility, beyond the responsibility that we certainly have as individuals to care for our neighbor. He says this: each day offers us a new opportunity, a new possibility. We have the space we need for co-responsibility in creating and putting into place new processes and changes. Let us take an active part in renewing and supporting our troubled societies. So there, very clearly, he makes the bridge, the transition, using this parable not only to apply to our individual responsibility, but also our responsibility in the larger global perspective.
You know, one thing beautiful that I see in this chapter, Stranger on the Road, is when he almost defines us humans as we were made for love in paragraph 88. And then Pope particularly exhorts us to recognize Christ in the face of every excluded person. I think it's an amazing chapter, and I hope you'll go back and read this chapter. Chapter 3 is entitled Envisioning an Open World. What would you say are some of the key points of this chapter?
Well, again, he uses the word open a lot, and it's part of his vision that we need to open ourselves beyond just our local concerns, our national concerns, to the concerns of the whole world. So it's a call really to expand our view of our relationship with others, including those different from us. How we make a more universal connection to those who are not just around the corner, but around the world. In one paragraph he says, "No one can experience the true beauty of life without relating to others, without having real faces to love." This is a part of what you were referring to just a minute ago, Paulson. This is part of the mystery of authentic human existence. Life exists where there is bonding, community, fraternity, and life is stronger than death when it is built on true relationships and bonds of fidelity. On the contrary, there is no life when we claim to be self-sufficient and live as islands. In these attitudes, death prevails.
Thank you for that. In opening up the meaning of the parable of the Good Samaritan in chapter 2, and in envisioning an open world in chapter 3, Francis makes some connections to key elements of Catholic social teaching. Which elements are these?
Well, I'm going to pick out three that I think are predominant, and we've already heard a couple of them in the quotes that I've shared with you from the encyclical. The first one is the basic dignity of every human person. This is his fundamental premise, and he mentions it countless times as the foundation of Catholic social thought. Here's another quote. "Social friendship and universal fraternity necessarily call for an acknowledgement of the worth of every human person, always and everywhere. If each individual is of such great worth, it must be stated clearly and firmly that the mere fact that some people are born and placed with fewer resources or less development does not justify the fact that they are living with less dignity. This is a basic principle of social life that tends to be ignored in a variety of ways by those who sense that it does not fit into their worldview or serve their purpose." He goes on to say in the next slide, "The world exists for everyone because all of us were born with the same dignity. Differences of color, religion, talent, place of birth or residence, and so many others cannot be used to justify the privileges of some over the rights of all. As a community, we have an obligation to ensure that every person lives with dignity and has sufficient opportunities for his or her integral development." And that last statement ties to the second element of Catholic social church teaching that he reinforces through the document, and that is a focus on the common good, not just our own individual good. Common good refers to a sense of community and to the well-being of the entire community, leaving nobody behind. And it's very much connected to the third dimension, which is termed solidarity. And here I'm simply, again, going to let Pope Francis's words speak for themselves. Solidarity is a word that is not always well received. In certain situations, it has become a dirty word, a word that dare not be said. Solidarity means much more than engaging in sporadic acts of generosity. It means thinking and acting in terms of community. It means that the lives of all are prior to the appropriation of goods by a few. It also means combating the structural causes of poverty, inequality, the lack of work, land, and housing, the denial of social and labor rights. It means confronting the destructive effects of the empire of money. So some very clear ties and very supportive and strong language in terms of these key elements of the teaching of the church in relationship to the individual, the common good, and our solidarity with our brothers and sisters around the world.
One of the things as I listen to you speak and as I myself have gone through this chapter is Pope basically defines the spiritual stature of a person's life is measured by love. For him, love takes precedence over everything else and leads us to seek better life for other people, far from selfishness. I mean, so much emphasis is on the human person, on the human dignity.
Well, can I just
Yes.
comment on that for a minute, because I'm reminded of the gospel readings over the course of the last several weeks and the ones that are still to come before we get into the season of Advent. Remember, we go back a couple of weeks, and these are all gospels from the final discourse. Jesus is getting ready to go through his passion, death, and resurrection. He's sending very important messages to his apostles and disciples. But several weeks ago, it was being asked the question, what is the greatest commandment? And he answers, the greatest commandment is to love God with your whole heart, your whole soul, your whole mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So again, back to what you said, Paulson, the foundation here of the fundamental commandments are all based on this idea of love. Then we went to the Beatitudes, I think the following Sunday, where again we were instructed really through this sermon that Jesus gave about all the ways in which we are fortunate or happy or blessed. And again, examples or opportunities for how we need to express our love to our neighbor. And probably the penultimate gospel, the last one of the liturgical year before Advent, is Matthew 25, when Jesus is talking about how the last judgment will happen and the separation of the sheep and the goats. And it's all based on how people responded to the needs of others out of love and care and concern and compassion. I was hungry and you gave me to eat, thirsty and you gave me to drink, a stranger and you welcomed me, in prison and you visited me. And they're confused. When did we do that, Lord? When did we do that? Well, as long as you did it to the least of my brothers, you did it for me. So there's this sense that we find Jesus through our love of those who are less fortunate, those in any kind of need, those we encounter in simple ways where we can provide acts of kindness throughout the course of our day, or in the big moments of life where we're asked to respond in especially big ways to the needs of others. Because in those needs is where we find Christ, where Christ is.
Thank you, Jim. I just want to add, recently one of the scripture passages that really touched my heart is from Exodus when God said, if the poor man cries out to me, I will hear him, for I am compassionate. And that's amazing because God describes himself as being compassionate. And as I read these chapters, our Holy Father really has discovered a God of scriptures, a God of compassion, a God of love. Let me transition to chapter 4, entitled A Heart Open to the World. Now, where does this chapter take us?
Well, there's that word "open" again. That openness to the world and to the peoples of the world. And in this chapter, Francis opens up for us, really, in a very robust way, his vision of a world family, a world community that's based on an openness of heart to which he calls us all. And this moves us beyond a narrow nationalism or a narrow individualism to a broader sense of community and a more global kind of perspective. Here's the way he puts it in one of the paragraphs from this chapter. The true worth of the different countries of our world is measured by their ability to think not simply as a country, but also as a part of the larger human family. It should be kept in mind that an innate tension exists between globalization and localization. We need to pay attention to the global in order to avoid narrowness and banality, yet we also need to look to the local, which keeps our feet on the ground. For it is healthy relationships between love of one's native land and a sound sense of belonging to our larger human family. It is helpful to keep in mind that global society is not the sum total of different countries, but rather the communion, the community that exists among them. And I guess with that we can conclude, because we're almost, or we are out of time. I just wanted to say next week we do the next 4 chapters, and we've got, again, some intriguing titles. Chapter 5, A Better Kind of Politics. That should be interesting. Chapter 6, Dialogue and Friendship in Society. This is where Francis gets down to the nitty-gritty of how we're going to change things, and how we're going to bridge our differences, and how we're going to engage each other with respect, and trying to find common ground in our various perspectives on the trends and issues that he has outlined for us. Related to that, he talks in the 7th chapter about paths of renewed encounter, and the last chapter, how religions can be at the service of this concept of the fraternity of the world, this social friendship that he hopes will exist among countries and among all the peoples of the countries of the world.
Thank you, Jim, for enlightening us this evening. And I'm sure you will make available your notes for those of us who want to read them. Is that right?
Yes, I could do that. Certainly.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we will put these notes on our parish website. We can also give a link to that on our Facebook page for you to read. But as Jim presented and I listened to it, and I myself am so much edified by this encyclical, because it gets to the heart of Scripture. You know, people say Pope Francis is worried about social justice. Well, that's the doctrine of the Church. But beyond that, everything that Pope Francis touches and describes gets us to the heart of Scripture. Whether it's the Old Testament or whether it's the New Testament, whether it's the story of the Good Samaritan. And it is very thought-provoking. If you read this encyclical and at some point you don't get upset, you don't feel challenged, then you're not reading it correctly. That's what I would say. But once again, thank you so much, and we hope to see you for our next session You guys have a wonderful